What happens when Hollywood royalty meets hard journalism on live television? In just 47 seconds, a single comment would transform a routine morning interview into the most explosive meltdown in daytime television history. The cameras were rolling, millions were watching, and nobody was prepared for what Meghan Markle was about to unleash on George Stephanopoulos. The Good Morning America studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. George Stephanopoulos sat behind the iconic news desk, reviewing his notes one final time. Today's guest was supposed to be a softball interview, a friendly chat about charity work and upcoming projects. The producers had promised an easy segment to fill the morning slot. 30 seconds to air, called out the floor director. George straightened his tie and looked directly into camera one. He had conducted thousands of interviews over his career, sat across from presidents and prime ministers. But something felt different this morning. There was an unusual tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. Good morning. I'm George Stephanopoulos, and joining me now is Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, here to discuss her latest philanthropic endeavors. The camera panned to reveal Meghan sitting in the guest chair, her posture rigid and her smile forced. She wore an elegant cream-colored blazer, but her eyes held a coldness that the wardrobe couldn't mask. "Thank you for having me, George," she said, her voice carrying an edge that seemed inappropriate for morning television. "It's our pleasure. I understand you're launching a new initiative focused on women's empowerment. Can you tell our viewers about that?" Meghan's smile faltered for just a moment. "Well, George, I think the real question is why it took so long for someone like me to be given this platform. The media has been incredibly unfair to me, and frankly, I'm tired of playing nice." George blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected pivot. "I'm not sure I understand. We invited you here to discuss your charity work." "Did you, though?" Meghan leaned forward, her voice rising slightly. "Or did you invite me here so you could ask me the same tired questions about palace drama and family disputes? I see right through this, George." The veteran journalist maintained his composure, years of experience keeping his expression neutral. "Meghan, I assure you that wasn't our intention. We genuinely want to hear about your foundation work." "Your intention?" she scoffed. "Let's talk about intentions, shall we? Your network has run dozens of negative stories about me. You've allowed commentators to tear apart my character, my marriage, my choices. And now you sit there pretending this is some friendly conversation?" George could see the interview spiraling, but his professional instincts kicked in. "I understand you've faced criticism, but many public figures deal with media scrutiny. How do you channel that into positive change through your work?" The question seemed to ignite something in Meghan. Her carefully maintained composure began to crack, and her voice took on a sharp, accusatory tone. "Many public figures? George, are you really going to sit there and compare my situation to anyone else's? Do you know what it's like to be attacked daily by the British press? Do you understand the level of racism and sexism I've endured?" "I can't pretend to understand your personal experience," George replied carefully, "but I think our viewers would be interested in how you're using your platform to help others facing similar challenges." "Help others?" Meghan's laugh was bitter. "George, I think you're missing the point entirely. I shouldn't have to help anyone. The system should change. People like you should be doing better journalism instead of enabling the machine that tears people down." The studio felt eerily quiet, except for the hum of equipment. Camera operators exchanged glances, unsure whether to keep rolling. The producers in the control room watched in stunned silence as their routine morning segment transformed into something unprecedented. George took a deep breath, drawing on decades of experience interviewing difficult subjects. "Meghan, I respect your passion, but I think we might be getting away from why you're here. Your foundation has done remarkable work with literacy programs. Can we focus on that positive impact?" "Positive impact?" Meghan's voice grew louder, more agitated. "You want to talk about positive impact? How about the impact of responsible journalism? How about the impact of treating people with basic human decency instead of turning their lives into entertainment?" "I believe we do practice responsible journalism," George responded evenly. "We fact-check our stories, we seek multiple sources, and we try to present balanced coverage." "Balanced?" Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward. "You call what you've done to me balanced? You've participated in a character assassination, George. You and every other so-called journalist who has platformed the lies and distortions about my life." George remained seated, his voice calm but firm. "Meghan, I think you might be directing your frustration at the wrong person. I've always tried to cover your story fairly." "Fairly?" She began pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. "Do you think it's fair to constantly question my motives?" Do you think it's fair to analyze every outfit I wear, every expression on my face, every word I speak? You've made me into a villain, George, and I won't stand for it anymore." The veteran journalist could feel the interview slipping completely out of control, but his years of training kept him centered. "I understand you're upset, but perhaps we could use this platform to address some of those concerns constructively." Constructively? Meghan spun around to face him directly. "George, the only constructive thing would be for people like you to stop pretending you're innocent in all this. You're part of the problem. You enable the toxicity, and then you act surprised when someone finally calls you out." In the control room, the executive producer frantically gestured to the floor director. They were supposed to go to commercial break 5 minutes ago, but nobody wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. This was television gold, even if it was completely unscripted chaos. George maintained eye contact with his increasingly agitated guest. "Meghan, I appreciate your candor, but I think you're painting with a rather broad brush. Many journalists, myself included, have covered positive aspects of your work and advocacy." "Positive aspects?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "Oh, thank you so much for throwing me the occasional bone, George. Thank you for acknowledging that I'm human just often enough to make your attack seem balanced. Do you want a medal for basic decency?" The seasoned anchor had interviewed hostile subjects before, but this level of personal attack was unusual for daytime television. He could see Meghan was beyond reason, but his professionalism demanded he try to salvage something productive from the segment. "I think there might be a misunderstanding here," he said carefully. "We invited you on the show because we value your perspective and want to give you a platform to share your message." "A platform?" Meghan laughed harshly. "This isn't a platform, George. This is a trap. You invite me here under the pretense of discussing charity work, but what you really want is drama. You want me to break down, to give you clips you can replay endlessly." "That's simply not true," George replied firmly. "We have a genuine interest in your foundation's work with literacy and women's empowerment." "Stop lying to me." The words exploded from Meghan with startling force. "Just stop pretending this is anything other than What It Island. You're all the same. You smile and shake hands and act professional, but underneath it all, you're just waiting for the moment you can tear someone apart." The studio atmosphere grew thick with tension as Meghan's outburst hung in the air. George could feel the weight of every eye in the room watching him, waiting to see how he would handle this unprecedented situation. His decades of experience had taught him that the best response to unreasonable behavior was unwavering professionalism. "Meghan, I understand you're frustrated, but I need to respectfully disagree with your characterization of our intentions here," he said, his voice steady and measured. "We invited you because your voice matters, and we wanted to give you an opportunity to share your important work with our audience." Meghan stopped pacing and fixed him with a withering stare. "My voice matters? George, if my voice actually mattered, you wouldn't spend equal time giving platforms to people who spread lies about me. You wouldn't treat gossip columnists and royal correspondents as legitimate news sources. We cover many different perspectives on stories that are in the public interest." George responded diplomatically. "That's part of comprehensive journalism." "Comprehensive journalism?" She practically spat the words. "Is that what you call it when you invite someone on your show and then spend 20 minutes rehashing tabloid rumors? Is that what you call it when you ask loaded questions designed to make someone look defensive?" George leaned forward slightly, his expression remaining calm but concerned. "Meghan, I haven't asked you any questions about tabloid rumors today. Every question I've posed has been about your charitable work and advocacy." "Oh, please," she waved her hand dismissively. "Don't act like you're some innocent bystander in all this. You've been part of the media circus from day one. You've contributed to the narrative that I'm difficult, demanding, unreasonable." "I've tried to cover your story objectively," George replied. "Sometimes that means reporting on controversies, but it also means highlighting your achievements in advocacy work." Meghan began pacing again, her agitation growing more visible with each step. "Objectively? There's nothing objective about the way you've covered me, George. You've allowed anonymous sources to make wild claims. You've given credence to people with obvious agendas. That's not journalism, that's gossip." The camera operators continued rolling, unsure whether this meltdown was something they should be capturing. In the control room, producers debated whether to cut the feed, but the raw drama was unlike anything they'd ever broadcast during their morning slot. George took a measured breath before responding. "I understand that media coverage can feel overwhelming, especially when you're in the public eye, but I think it's important to distinguish between legitimate news reporting and tabloid speculation." "Legitimate news reporting?" Meghan's voice rose to a near shout. "George, there is nothing legitimate about the way you people operate. You hide behind the concept of public interest while you destroy people's lives for entertainment. That's a serious accusation, George replied, his tone becoming firmer. I've spent my career trying to inform the public about important issues. I take journalistic ethics very seriously. Journalistic ethics? She laughed bitterly. Where were your ethics when you ran stories based on palace leaks that were obviously designed to damage me? Where were your ethics when you platformed people who questioned my children's safety and well-being? George could feel his patience being tested, but his professional demeanor never wavered. If you have specific concerns about our coverage, I'd be happy to discuss them after the show. But right now, we have an opportunity to talk about the positive work you're doing. After the show? Meghan turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing. George, there isn't going to be an after-the-show conversation. You think I'm going to sit here and pretend everything is fine while you continue to participate in the systematic destruction of my reputation? The veteran journalist realized that any attempt to redirect the conversation was futile. Meghan was determined to air her grievances on live television, regardless of the consequences or appropriateness of the forum. I think you're attributing motives to me that simply aren't accurate, he said calmly. But I'm willing to listen if you want to share specific examples of coverage you found unfair. Specific examples? Her voice dripped with incredulity. George, where do I even begin? The constant speculation about my relationship with Catherine, the endless analysis of my body language, the suggestions that I'm manipulative, calculating, social climbing. Those characterizations didn't come from me personally, George replied. And I think it's worth noting that public figures often face scrutiny that can feel unfair or excessive. Don't you dare compare me to other public figures, Meghan snapped. My situation is unique. The level of vitriol, the racial undertones, the coordinated campaign to paint me as the villain in every scenario. You've been complicit in all of it. George could see that reasoning with her was impossible, but his journalistic instincts compelled him to try once more. Meghan, if there are racial undertones in coverage, that's something we should address seriously. But I don't think broad accusations help solve the problem. Solve the problem? She shook her head in disbelief. George, you are the problem. You and every other journalist who pretends to be neutral while participating in character assassination. You've made it impossible for me to do my work, to live my life, to protect my family. The studio fell silent, except for the mechanical sounds of cameras and equipment. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, a complete breakdown of the normal boundaries between interviewer and subject. George maintained his composure, despite the personal nature of the attacks. I'm sorry you feel that way, but I disagree with your assessment of my role in this situation. I've always tried to treat you with respect and fairness. Respect and fairness? Meghan's voice became shrill. You call it respectful to constantly question my motives? You call it fair to give equal weight to my voice and the voices of people who actively work to undermine me? I call it balanced journalism, George replied firmly. Sometimes that means presenting multiple perspectives on controversial topics. Controversial topics? She was practically shouting now. My existence isn't a controversial topic, George. My marriage isn't a debate to be arbitrated by you and your colleagues. My choices as a mother, as a woman, as a human being, shouldn't be dissected for public consumption. The experienced anchor could feel the interview reaching a breaking point, but his professional obligations required him to maintain some semblance of control over the segment. I understand this is emotional for you, he said gently. But perhaps we could channel that passion into discussing how your experiences could help other people facing similar challenges. Help other people? Meghan's response was immediate and furious. George, I can't help anyone when I'm constantly defending myself against attacks that you and your industry create and perpetuate. I can't be effective when every word I speak is twisted and analyzed and weaponized against me. George realized that the interview had moved far beyond any possibility of productive conversation. Meghan was determined to use this platform as a venue for her grievances, regardless of how it reflected on her or the show. I think we may need to agree to disagree about the media's role, he said diplomatically, but I hope you can find constructive ways to address these concerns. Constructive ways? Her laugh was harsh and bitter. The only constructive thing would be for people like you to stop pretending you're innocent victims when someone finally calls out your behavior. The tension in the studio reached a fever pitch as Meghan's accusations grew more personal and unhinged. George could sense that his guest was spiraling completely out of control, but his years of experience interviewing volatile subjects kept him anchored in professionalism. Meghan, I think we're getting into territory that isn't productive for anyone, he said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated countless difficult interviews. Perhaps we should take a step back and refocus on the positive message you came here to share." "Positive message?" Meghan whirled around to face him, her composure completely shattered. "George, the only message I have is that people like you have made my life hell, and I'm not going to smile and pretend otherwise anymore. You want positive? Try being honest about what you've done." George could see the camera operators looking uncomfortable, unsure whether they should continue filming this unprecedented meltdown. In all his years of broadcasting, he had never witnessed a guest completely lose control in such a public and destructive manner. "I've been honest throughout my career," he replied steadily. "If you have specific grievances with our coverage, there are appropriate channels to address those concerns. But using this platform to launch personal attacks isn't helping anyone." "Personal attacks?" Meghan's voice reached a new octave of indignation. "You think calling out your unprofessional behavior constitutes a personal attack? George, you've participated in years of actual personal attacks against me, and now you're going to play the victim?" The veteran journalist felt his patience wearing thin, but his professional training kept his response measured. "I'm not playing victim, Meghan. I'm trying to have a constructive conversation, but you seem determined to turn this into something confrontational." "Confrontational?" She began gesticulating wildly, her movements becoming increasingly erratic. "This isn't confrontational, George. This is accountability. This is what happens when someone finally refuses to play along with your games." George glanced toward the control room, knowing that the producers were likely scrambling to figure out how to handle this situation. He had conducted thousands of interviews, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this level of unhinged behavior from a guest. "I understand you're upset," he said carefully, "but I think you're misdirecting your anger. I've always tried to treat you fairly in our coverage." "Fairly?" Meghan's laugh was becoming increasingly manic. "You think it's fair to constantly scrutinize every aspect of my life? You think it's fair to give platforms to people who spread lies and conspiracy theories about me and my family? We report on stories that are in the public interest," George replied, maintaining his composure despite the increasingly hostile environment. "That sometimes includes covering controversies, but we strive for accuracy and balance." "Public interest?" She was practically screaming now, her face flushed with anger. "There is no public interest in destroying someone's reputation for entertainment. There is no journalistic value in turning someone's private struggles into public spectacle." The studio audience, which had been silent throughout the exchange, began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away, clearly embarrassed by what they were witnessing. Others stared in fascination at the complete breakdown occurring before their eyes. George realized that any attempt to salvage the interview was futile, but his professional obligations required him to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. "Meghan, I think this conversation has moved away from anything constructive," he said firmly. "If you'd like to discuss your foundation's work, I'm happy to continue. Otherwise, perhaps we should end the interview here." "End the interview?" Her response was immediate and explosive. "Oh no, George. You don't get to control this narrative anymore. You invited me here, and now you're going to hear what I have to say about the damage you've done." George could feel the situation spiraling completely beyond his control, but his decades of experience kept him centered. "I've given you a platform to speak, Meghan, but this isn't the appropriate venue for personal grievances or accusations." "Appropriate venue?" She was pacing frantically now, her movements becoming more agitated with each step. "When is the appropriate venue, George? When you're running hit pieces based on anonymous sources? When you're analyzing my every move for signs of devious behavior?" The experienced anchor realized that Meghan was completely beyond reason, determined to use this platform for her own agenda, regardless of the consequences or appropriateness. "I think we need to wrap this up," he said with quiet authority, his voice cutting through her agitation. "This isn't serving anyone well, including you." "Serving anyone well?" Meghan stopped pacing and fixed him with a wild stare. "You know what doesn't serve anyone well, George? Journalists who hide behind the pretense of objectivity while they systematically destroy people's lives for ratings." George had reached his limit. Throughout his career, he had maintained professionalism even in the most challenging circumstances. But this guest was testing every boundary of appropriate behavior. "Meghan, I'm going to have to ask you to either discuss your charitable work or conclude this interview," he said with unmistakable finality. "This behavior is unacceptable for our program and our audience." The words seemed to trigger something even more volatile in Meghan. Her eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine shock that someone had dared to establish boundaries with her. "Unacceptable?" Her voice rose to a shriek. "You think my behavior is unacceptable? George, your entire industry's behavior toward me has been unacceptable. The lies, the manipulation, The coordinated attacks on my character and my family. I'm not responsible for an entire industry, George replied with steel in his voice. But I am responsible for maintaining standards on this program, and what's happening right now falls far below those standards. Meghan stared at him in apparent disbelief, as if the concept of being held accountable for her behavior was completely foreign to her experience. Standards? She laughed bitterly. You want to talk about standards, George? Where were your standards when you allowed your network to run stories questioning my children's safety? Where were your standards when you platformed people spreading conspiracy theories about my motivations? George stood up from behind his desk, a clear signal that the interview was over. His movement was deliberate and authoritative, the gesture of someone who had reached the absolute end of his patience. This interview is concluded, he said with quiet but unmistakable finality. Thank you for coming on the show, Meghan, but I think it's best if we end things here. The studio fell completely silent. Camera operators stopped moving. Producers froze in the control room, and the audience held its collective breath. Nobody had ever seen a guest so completely lose control, or a host so definitively end an interview. Meghan stood frozen for a moment, apparently stunned that someone had actually established boundaries with her. Her face cycled through a range of expressions, from shock to indignation to something approaching panic. You can't just end this, she said, her voice suddenly uncertain. I'm not finished talking. Yes, you are, George replied calmly, his authority absolute. Security will escort you out. As if summoned by his words, 2 security guards appeared at the edge of the set. They moved quietly but purposefully toward the guest area, their presence making it clear that the interview was definitively over. Meghan looked around the studio wildly, apparently realizing for the first time that her behavior had consequences. The faces staring back at her ranged from embarrassed to horrified to disgusted. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she said desperately, her voice cracking. You invite someone on your show and then silence them when they tell uncomfortable truths. George didn't respond. He simply stood behind his desk, watching as security gently but firmly guided his former guest toward the exit. His expression remained professional, but there was an unmistakable sense of relief that the ordeal was finally ending. The last image viewers saw was Meghan being escorted from the studio, still protesting as she disappeared from view, while George stood silently at his desk, his dignity and professionalism intact, despite the unprecedented challenge he had just navigated.